Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Amanda Lewis. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy here at UIC. For those of us who don't know us, the Institute's mission is to improve the quantity, quality, and impact of research on race and public policy, and to help UIC serve its mission as an urban public research university to produce knowledge in the service of transformation. Much of our work cuts across institutional and departmental boundaries, and in today's context especially, even though it's only a mile, the often too large divide between East and West campuses. We seek to deepen and expand our understanding of inequalities, and as we look for research-based solutions to the challenges we face locally and nationally. The talk today is part of our Embodied Inequalities series that we've been doing for the last 2 years, which builds on important work that has documented extensive racial disparities in health to explore further why race and other forms of identity matter so much, have so many consequences for health outcomes. Clearly, many UIC scholars are doing really important work in these issues already, and we're hoping to just bring more attention to these issues and to deepen the conversation within and across campus. This series is very much a joint effort between IRPP and a growing number of partners and co-sponsors, including the Office of the Associate Vice Chancellor for Community-Based Practice, the School of Public Health, the University of Illinois Cancer Center, the Institute for Health Research and Policy, the Social Justice Initiative, the Center of Excellence in Maternal and Child Health, and particularly for today, the Health Humanities Program in the Department of Medical Education. And I want to turn it over to Sandy Soufian, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
I'm short, so I have to move this all the way down. Okay. So I'm Sandy Soufian. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Medical Education in the Health Humanities program. And on behalf of that program, I'd like to welcome you to the 2018 Joseph S. Begando Keynote Lecture that we are doing with IRPP and the Embodied Inequality. Thank you. Embodied Inequalities. So the Department of Medical Education sponsors the Begando Lecture every year in order to bring distinguished scholars in the field of health humanities and social sciences to the UIC community. Dr. Begando was the Chancellor of the Health Sciences Center who authorized the creation of a program in medical humanities for the health sciences. We are very pleased this year to be collaborating with IRPP and also the Health and Society Working Group of the Institute for the Humanities. And I want to thank Bhargavi Dani Reddy, who is our Health Humanities Assistant and has been central in organizing the event today. Finally, I would like to thank you for coming and for Dr. Keith Wailoo for agreeing to share his work with us. Keith and I have known each other for, I was thinking about it, 17 years when I was at Rutgers. And I can tell you that you are in for a real treat. Dr. Wailoo is Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton, where he teaches in the Department of History and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He is an award-winning author with expertise on topics ranging from drugs and drug policy, race, science, and health in the U.S., and U.S. healthcare policy and medical affairs. His books attest to the wide range of topics that Keith has mastered. They include Pain, a Political History, which is what he's going to talk about today, How Cancer Crossed the Color Line, The Troubled Dream of Genetic Medicine, Dying in the City of Blues, Sickle Cell Anemia and the Politics of Race and Health, and Drawing Blood, Technology and Disease Identity in 20th Century America. Keith has also co-edited books on the topics of Medicare and Medicaid, the HPV vaccine, transplantation and medical citizenship, which I give my disability studies students in the medical school every year, and race and vulnerability. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, where he currently serves as the chair of the interest group on health policy and healthcare systems. And I could go on and on, but instead, I think it's better if we spend time listening to Keith share his work. Welcome.
Thanks, Sandy, for that wonderful introduction, and Amanda for sponsoring, as well as the other sponsors for this. So in the interest of not keeping you too long, I will be speaking somewhat quickly, a little more quickly than I usually do, which might be a challenge. I'm not sure. I think she can probably keep up with me. On the politics of pain, the question of medicine, social difference, and the gatekeepers of relief in America. And my interest in pain, really as a chronic pain, as a historical topic and a topic in contemporary public policy, began with a book that I did previously, my second book, called Dying in the City of the Blues, which focused on sickle cell disease. And when I first started to do research on this, what I learned is that the question of how to adequately care for people with sickle cell pain when they're experiencing crises wasn't just a clinical question or a biologically informed question. It was also a social and political one. Sickle cell disease, for many of you, if you don't know, is a disease that's characterized by recurring infections, early mortality, certainly in the early days in the 1930s and 40s and through the 50s and 60s and still today, and recurring painful crises. When I started doing research, which is situated in Memphis, Tennessee, I encountered the fact that in the 1960s, sickle cell disease was rising in popular as well as clinical awareness as a new disease, despite the fact that it was well known since the 1920s, teens and 20s, characterized particularly by this painful suffering among African Americans that had too long been ignored. And you can see how the rising awareness of this distinctive African American malady resonated with the shifting cultural and political currents of the 1960s, of the civil rights era. So rising awareness really relates to changing political awareness. It was also in this context that I read the work of Memphis-based researchers who worried and who reminded me or taught me that the response to pain varies by geography. One of the Memphis-based researchers pointed to the fact that even as sickle cell disease awareness was rising in science and medicine, he said the people in Oakland and Chicago disagree with us. They feel that we undertreat people in sickle cell crisis because we're too anxious about the misuse of medications. We, on the other hand, think that they overtreat. And there I have a sense that how we respond to a disease, how do we respond to pain, is inflected by and informed by the surrounding cultural climate. Conservatism in the Mid-South, as opposed to what he was arguing, a more liberal approach to compassionate relief in cities like Chicago or in Oakland. What I was also able to do in this book is to track how patterns of care change over time. So if the story that he was telling about the 60s was one in which you saw a new awareness, but this new geography of relief, I could also track how by the 1990s, patients with sickle cell disease found themselves confronted by increasing skepticism, perhaps frustration voiced by nurses or ER doctors about whether their pain was real or not. To what extent were they faking pain in order to obtain medications? Were they drug seekers or were they truly patients in pain? And you could say that this was an example of how, once again, the cultural climate of increasing skepticism found its way into the clinic, where it shadowed and informed the caregiver's decisions. In fact, the image on the cover of my book comes from a magazine story, and you can't really see it very clearly, but it's a graphic image that's supposed to capture a patient twisted and contorted with thorns coming out of their body to symbolize the pain. But beneath that, in the magazine, the article was about sickle cell disease. The caption read, "Before you can get past the agony, you have to convince a doctor that it's real." So the book that I wrote was really about how this history of sickle cell disease was a history of shifting attitudes towards race as reflected through the story of sickle cell care, and how those attitudes about race shaped clinical practice and broader social policy. You might say what I learned there was that there was a micropolitics of pain. That is, that painful crises, one of the questions that confronts caregivers is, Is this crisis, is this pain real? How aggressively should it be treated? And if treated aggressively, with what mix of narcotics, and what are the implications? But there's also a macro politics of pain. The question of which pain is real and whose pain matters. A question that you might say moves from the clinical realm out into the public policy realm. And many of the problems of pain sit precisely here at the intersection of micropolitics in the clinic and macropolitics, making decision-making about chronic pain really perplexing for the gatekeepers of relief, by which as you'll see, I don't only mean physicians and caregivers. There are many others that keep the gates, who regulate the traffic of care. What are some of the concerns for those gatekeepers? Well, there's the question of suspicion, right? How real is your pain? How sincerely are you expressing your pain? And how much should I pay attention to it or validate your complaint? There's also increasingly the question of the financial costs, as well as the clinical frustrations of dealing with people with any chronic illness, particularly with chronic pain. Right? If you're not even sure that the pain is real and what its severity is, but the patient keeps coming back, asking for more, what often builds among practitioners is a sense of frustration, as if we're oriented towards cure, not necessarily towards really long-term care of this kind. And then you have this other shadow of a concern, a suspicion and an anxiety about whether, in the name of compassionate care, we are not producing a new kind of problem. The more compassionate we are towards people in chronic pain, how much does this feed dependence? How much does it feed addiction? These are the kinds of places where the micropolitics and the macropolitics of pain come together, making it a very fraught area for investigation. And this is the question that I began to take on for my next book, the book on the politics of pain more generally. When I started doing the research on this book, it became clear that the kinds of issues that I found in sickle cell disease are also reflected elsewhere in medicine generally. Articles like this appeared in the American Journal of Public Health, noting that there were racial and ethnic disparities in emergency room analgesic prescription. That is, this is based on two studies. There were two studies in the 1990s and 2000s, one in Los Angeles that highlighted that Latinos were less likely to be treated aggressively for long bone fracture pain, and another in Atlanta which highlighted that African Americans were less likely to be treated aggressively for long bone fracture pain as compared to Anglo Americans. You might say there's much documentation that highlights that race and the understanding of pain was a persistent topic both in clinical contexts and also in society. Here's an article from 2016 based on a study, and I'll get back to this at the very end, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, highlighting that there were disturbing new findings in terms of what medical students and residents think about African Americans in pain versus white folks in pain. And articles in the PNAS produced news stories like this in the Washington Post, really trying to grapple with the perplexing problems that shadow pain management. In this case, that whites are more likely than blacks to be prescribed strong pain medicines for equivalent ailments. So what I want to talk about today, and what my book is really about, is how to make sense, insofar as one can make sense of this problem of pain, how to make sense of the question of why pain has been so controversial for so long in medicine and US society. And I hope today just to illustrate some of the reasons for that controversy and how that controversy has unfolded to produce the kinds of debates that we have today surrounding things like opioids. Well, the fundamental question, source of confusion is the problem of measurement. Reliable measurement of pain is tricky. Pain is subjective, and experts depend on individual patients' subjective indices. The complaint itself is the thing that we turn to in order to validate the extent and the character of pain. It's not, unlike the American Pain Society wants to say that pain is the fifth vital sign, comparable to temperature and blood pressure, but it's not, in the sense that it doesn't relate to pathology in precisely the same ways that temperature or blood pressure or respiration rate does. So turning it into an objective measure has been particularly perplexing. It doesn't really, it's in the subjective realm, and doctors have to make sense of it. So this cartoon from New Yorker kind of captures the tension. The doctor is standing over the patient's bedside and says, we can give you enough medication to alleviate the pain, but not enough to make it fun. So where is the line between compassionate pain relief and the production of pleasure? And who's to say that being relieved of your pain isn't a source of pleasure? Who draws the line? Well, in this feature, but also generally, in this particular characterization and generally, it's the patient who will tell you. And we rely on those subjective indications. And then, as I mentioned, there's a social and clinical anxiety about relating to the fear of drug dependency and addiction to opioids and others that can vary by individual, that always shadows the decision-making around what to do about pain. Now, so the gatekeeper's dilemma, which is what I want to talk about today, really helps to illuminate this controversy. How to draw the lines between legitimate complaints of pain and illegitimate complaints. I'll give you one example. In the 1990s, there emerged in American public in general and in medicine a question about the adequate relief of pain at the end of life pain care. In states like Oregon, there was an embrace of physician-assisted suicide, the idea that compassionate care at the end of life should be a major reference point, really be a standard of care. But end-of-life pain care raises a question about whether morphine, which is known to suppress blood pressure and respiration, if administered too aggressively, where is the line between compassionate care at the end of life and physician-assisted suicide? Where is the line between compassionate care and euthanasia? And who is to judge? So this is once again another example of the blurry boundaries of pain care and how pain care can quickly become something else that's fraught and contentious in American society. There's another debate that's another kind of question that shadowed pain medicine, which is how do we know what pain is truly disabling? Who is to judge if pain is disabling or not? And how should people in chronic pain behave? Do we expect people to grin and bear it and persevere despite their pain? Or what do we think about people who complain too loudly or too frequently? These are really cultural judgments, often cross-cultural judgments about the proper way to behave when grappling with anguish and ache. So you might say, you know, one of the problems of pain is it's not like other indices that really relate to health, despite the fact that it's omnipresent in illness. One of the questions is pain a sign like pulse, blood pressure, respiration, and temperature? Is it related to pathology, or is it a symptom? Is it dependable or undependable? Are complaints evidence of maladjustment or malingering? Another cartoon where, you know, the cats are chasing the rabbit, and they say, they're not like us, they don't feel pain. Pain raises these questions of intersubjective understanding. In fact, one of the fathers of pain medicine, a physician from Washington State named John Bonica, was interviewed in 1974, asked Dr. Bonica, what is pain? Can science actually define the sensation? And he said at the time, if you ask 100 different authorities that question, you would get 100 different answers. That is to say, even the scientists were aware of how fundamentally cultural the problem of pain was. So, long introduction to say that pain exposes problems of how you weigh evidence, objective versus subjective evidence, not only in medicine, in law, but I hope to demonstrate in politics and society. And one of the surprising findings of this book is the gatekeepers of relief were not merely the practitioners. I was surprised to what extent these questions of adequate relief in medicine found their way through politics into the courts. And ultimately, it was judicial officials, judges, who had to make the decisions about where the lines of pain adequately experienced were and what the lines what the standards for appropriate relief ought to be. What I want to do very quickly, and I'm aware that I don't have a lot of time and I want to make sure there's time for questions, I want to take you through the history of this as seen through the lens of somebody like John Bonica and how this intersects with the problems of race and public policy today. I want to take you through his life. He started pain medicine after World War II, dealing with soldiers returning from the front. I want to take you through the birth of pain medicine as a field, the way in which society responded by liberalizing, opening the gates of relief, and thinking about pain as something that society needed to pay attention to. And then I want to talk about the closing off of access to pain care, particularly in the 1980s and beyond, during which the question of adequate pain relief intersected with broader questions about social welfare as well as disabilities. And I want to spend particularly the last time talking about where the recent decades have gone in the politics of pain in relationship to gatekeeping, but also whose pain matters and intersecting with questions of race. Now, when John Bonica came back from World War II and began taking care of people in pain, it was really not regarded as a mainstream topic in medicine, certainly not chronic pain. As one Boston psychiatrist said, the relief of pain is obviously one of the main functions of physicians, but ironically, it's one of the things we do least well, partly because we don't understand it. In fact, psychiatrists were often called upon to grapple with the pain complainant, the chronic pain complainant. Psychiatrists like Henry Albranda, who in a 1957 conference in California said that the patient in chronic pain was certainly worthy of study, but not necessarily worthy of sympathy. He wrote that complaints of chronic pain may develop in the child brought up to repress feelings of hatred, who then uses those complaints of pain to cover his hostile feelings towards an associate. For Albranda, the pain complaint needed to be looked at skeptically because malingering and all kinds of sort of secondary gains were part of the pain complaint. Masochistic self-punishment, he says, underlies the chronic painful condition. He was not alone. Psychiatrists and physicians generally looked with skepticism on the question of whether pain, chronic pain, really even belonged in medicine or whether it was should be turfed to places like psychology mostly, not psychiatry as much. These questions about malingering or playing sick persist today, but they were they were charged and much more prominent in the 1950s. Why was Henry Albranda so concerned about the legitimacy of pain? Well, it turns out that these questions were not just medical questions in the mid-1950s, they were also social policy questions. Just a year earlier, before that California conference, this gentleman, President Dwight Eisenhower, had signed into law a new disability benefit in Social Security, establishing a new kind of entitlement, not just for the elderly, but for people who were disabled and early infirm and incapable of taking care of themselves, working for a living. And the question that suddenly became a question of compensation and eligibility at the federal level was this: what is the proper evidence for a compensable disability? Well, we know that losing an arm or losing both of your legs is clearly understandable as a disability, but where does pain fit? These are the kinds of questions that were riling disability policymakers at the time, as well as Henry Albranda. And this is the kind of case that came before not just the Health, Education, and Welfare Department under Eisenhower, and then subsequently Kennedy, but also that came before judges. The landmark case is a case of a Texas housewife named Rosie Page, who brought her case before Secretary of HEW, Celebrezze. And her complaint and her request for disability benefits was denied. Well, if your request is denied, where do you go next? You go to court. You appeal. And she appealed her case. Her case was one in which experts characterized her as having arthritis with a marked psychogenic overlay of her symptoms. And here you see the blurry lines between physical pain and mental pain, and the question of its validity, especially in a housewife who had gone in and out of industrial work. She applied for benefits. She was rejected by HEW, and she took her appeal to federal court. And it's the case, it's the decision that's made in the federal circuit around hers that set in motion a way of thinking about pain in disability more generally. The decision was written by John R. Brown, a Republican appointee by Eisenhower, one of the Fifth Circuit Four, he was called, because he was a Republican, a moderate Republican who felt that you still had a responsibility to care for others. We should be our brother's keepers, he said, but not everyone had a right to be kept. A very different era in the history of Republican politics, to be sure. And he wrote in his landmark judicial ruling that if pain is real to the patient, the disability entitles the person to the statutory benefits. The fact that pain complained of by the claimant is not shown by objective clinical and laboratory findings does not mean that HEW must give little weight to allegations thereof. So this is what I mean by the surprise of seeing that it's judges who are deciding what the boundaries of relief ought to be. It starts off in the public policy realm, not in the clinic. And when John Bonica started working, there was this controversy roiling about pain and its proper relief. But then there was also this. It's an era in the post-war decades of pharmaceutical innovation, new drugs promising new innovative forms of effective relief. Percodan, which we know as OxyContin today, oxycodone, was new. Marketed by a company called Endo, promising to act fast, to produce lasting relief and thorough relief without the kinds of downsides that morphine brought. Morphine known to produce respiratory depression. This seemed to be as good, but without the respiratory depression. Scientists and clinicians said, this drug should not produce addiction. Why? Because the model of addiction at this time was a drug that was well tolerated and broken down, metabolized extremely slowly, should not produce euphoria, and as a result should not produce addiction. On the basis of these findings, Percodan was much more widely prescribed. These are the other, you might say there's a public sector debate about pain and its proper care, and there's a private sector debate about pain and its proper care as John Bonica is entering the field. Then as now, you might not be surprised to hear that the story of Percodan takes a turn in much the same way that the story of OxyContin and oxycodone took a turn. It didn't take long. By 1961, the California State Attorney General, Stanley Moss, is criticizing Endo as waging a high-powered campaign among doctors and pharmacists, really promoting the notion of Percodan prescription without consequences. He bemoans the drug company's apparent influence on the California Medical Association, which had found no reason for strict controls of Percodan. He says, which claimed that it lacked sufficient evidence to warrant returning to stricter controls. Then as now, this is an article that could be written, today, but this is 1963, the addiction potential of oxycodone. Then as now, concerns about Percodan, the false marketing of promises and addiction emerged. Then as now, there was a concern about the relationship between OxyContin or oxycodone use and heroin. For instance, Edward Bloomquist of the California Medical Association writes, the drug has acquired the unenviable status of being the principal choice as a substitute for heroin by California-based heroin addicts. So whereas today we're thinking about heroin addicts, OxyContin leading to heroin, here I would argue this is actually a less severe problem of heroin addicts turning to oxycodone. He also wrote that the times were changing. It may seem odd, he wrote, that California has become the center of Percodan use. Two factors, however, contribute to this. California, he says, has an undue share of unstable personalities who welcome bizarre methods of escaping reality. Well, this is, after all, the early 60s in California. He knows what he's talking about, and it's actually true. It's a social portrait, you might say, of drugs and sort of consciousness transformation in California at this time. But it's all of these anxieties that lead to the call for stricter controls. And then as now, we have the US Senate and the Congress weighing in. What should we do about this rising drug problem? It would be interesting if this was a different drug than OxyContin, but I want to emphasize it's the same drug, different formulation. In the 1960s, there are, you might say, the politics of pain shifts in dramatic ways. A new theory of pain arrives that in some ways endorses the idea that we should think expansively and broadly about what legitimate pain is and how we should care for people in legitimate pain. And the new theory is the gate control theory that validates subjective pain as real pain, much like John Brown did in his judicial opinion. The theory is the brainchild of a psychologist from McGill named Ronald Melzack and a physiologist from MIT named Patrick Wall. And what they argue is that we used to have a very narrow understanding of what pain was. The notion of a concept of a pain center in the brain, they argued, is totally inadequate to account for the sequence of behavior and experience. Indeed, they said the concept is pure fiction. Many different parts of the brain are responsible for the experience of pain. The thalamus, the limbic system, the hypothalamus, the parietal cortex, and the frontal cortex are all implicated in pain perception. And they came up with this sort of graphic image of what the gate control model was. Pain, they argue, was much more than stimulus, nerves, spinal cord, and then reception in the brain. Pain was also regulated by individual psychology, neurophysiology, past history, personality traits, and context. So the model of the gate control is that the gates of pain transmission open and close, the large fibers and the small fibers, regulated by a wide range of other phenomena, and highly individualized at that. So this changes the way we think about pain transmission, but also pain experience. The psychologist Ronald Melzack, one of the architects of this new model, really described this concept in retrospect as a concept that was riding in on the zeitgeist, a liberal model of pain for liberal times. He argued that to believe in the gate control theory of pain was to believe that more than just, let's say, Percodan could be used in the relief of pain, that physicians should really think about relaxants, tranquilizers, sedatives, suggestion, placebos, even hypnosis to modulate pain experience and to treat pain. All of these deserve more attention than they receive. So you can see how this new theory endorsed, you might say, a liberalization in medical practice. The idea that we should try many different approaches to pain. Pain was not one thing, it was many. Surgery surgery was one of many options. Drugs were another, but a multitude of other options should be explored. There are many other indices of the liberalization trend in pain medicine and pain in society in the 1960s, and I want to highlight a couple of them. One is the emergence of a book that becomes another important reference point, mostly for sociologists and sociologists and anthropologists, a book called People in Pain, written by an anthropologist named Mark Zabrowski. Now, looked at in retrospect, this is either a book that marks the recognition that culture shapes our expression of pain, that different people from different cultural backgrounds think about and express pain differently, or it's the worst form of ethnic stereotyping you can imagine. It's both, actually. It's not one or the other, it's both. So what he studies a VA hospital. He studies Jews, he studies old Americans, Anglo-Americans, he studies Irish and Italians, and what he finds is that Jews are vocal about their pain, they're highly suspicious of doctors, and always concerned about the pain and what's going to be done about it. Italians, he finds, tend to be vocal, but also trusting of doctors, but also present-oriented, as in, if the pain is present and excruciating, you will find a complaint, but if it has passed, it's as if it didn't exist. I'm overgeneralizing, but that's his sort of model. Irish, he argues, are what you might call pathologically stoic. They ignore pain as if it doesn't exist, as well as being highly suspicious of doctors. Like I said, it's ethnic stereotyping, and yet it's an attempt to say that doctors should think about culture as they think about the appropriate ways of treating pain. So it's a rival of the thing we might call cultural competency today in this highly stereotyped form. And of course, it won't surprise you to know that when he looks at what he calls the old Americans, the Anglo-Americans in the VA hospital, not only do they know how to rationalize pain, they know how to speak the language of pain that the doctors, who happen also to be Anglo-Americans, can understand. So they know when to ignore pain and when to rationalize it and when to complain about it. So you might say, as I said, this is both cultural sensitivity and stereotyping at work that indicates how ideas about pain are shifting in the late 60s into the 1970s. It's also the early 1970s that gives rise to a model that John Bonica created out in Washington that becomes more prevalent, which is the multidisciplinary pain clinic. The idea that you need a multitude of different experts to understand this complex thing called pain. Not just a psychiatrist, but also psychologists and surgeons and neurologists and pharmacologists and social workers, because pain is intersected with people's lives, and pain care ought to be as well. It's also at this time that you start to see, by the 1970s, a new phenomenon that we are also familiar with, the pain questionnaire. Ask the patient, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst pain you've ever had, how would you rate this pain? This is an invention of the early 1970s. Actually, it's the McGill Pain Questionnaire, really brought to us by Ronald Melzack. Or patient-controlled analgesia. Put the morphine drip in a controlled setting in the patient's hand and have them decide how much relief is necessary in that context. You might say this is a moment when the doctor-patient relationship is shifting, and when patients' subjective experiences are being deemed to be worthy of actually medical innovations. It's also a time in which the pain medicine field is emerging as a new field in its own right, and also a time in which earlier anxieties about the use of things like marijuana, heroin, LSD for terminally ill patients is being rethought. Now, the irony is only one of those has made it back into the public conversation, and that's marijuana today, right? So we have compassionate pain marijuana care as part of the public policy discussion today. Now, just to kind of segue into, you can see how the questions of race and the question of cultural difference become more and more important in the pain clinic in this time period. But there were skeptics about whether this theory, this gate control theory, really worked. And one of those skeptics was a British neurologist named P.W. Nathan, who said, you know, the thing about this theory is that it's led to many successful chronic pain treatments, but that doesn't mean it's right. In fact, there's been a long-standing scientific discussion about whether the gate control theory is actually worth the paper that it's written on. Is it really true that pain works this way? What P.W. Nathan ends up saying is, you know, some ideas need to be true, but ideas more need to be fruitful, but that doesn't mean that they're right. And curiously enough, he said the two don't necessarily go together. And for him, gate control theory was one of those theories. In fact, it led him and Patrick Wall to work together on something called the transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation unit, which is a belt that transmits electrical stimulants to arms or to backs in order to modulate pain. And in fact, it works. Whether it works because the gate control theory is true or not seemed kind of irrelevant. This is now an example of the liberalization of pain medicine, like moving away from drugs towards models of intervention that have nothing to do with pharmacology. You could also say that there's a shifting kind of geopolitical circumstances that are also pushing doctors to think even more broadly about pain. So when Richard Nixon, president in the 1970s, goes to China, Americans discover acupuncture. As this article says, nothing in the American rediscovery of China has excited popular imagination more than acupuncture anesthesia. And here, again, you have a new form of Eastern medicine arriving in the West, and a theory that also helps to explain, the gate control theory, helping to explain and legitimate acupuncture, which most Western physicians had dismissed as a clever trick of autosuggestion. So here you see the 1970s where geopolitical trends are changing the way people think about pain and pain medicine. In fact, it provokes John Bonica to go to China to learn as much as he can about acupuncture. That's a story for another time. But it shows you how cultural difference, and in this case political difference, is changing the way doctors think about the boundaries of pain care. And it's precisely in this context when John Bonica is asked by the US News and World Report, what is pain? And you can see why he answered the way he did. That if you ask 100 different experts that question, you have 100 different answers, because these are the indices of how you deal with pain in John Bonica's world. Some of them are pharmacological, some of them are instrumental, as in the TENS unit, some of them are the morphine drip, and some of them have to do with judicial rulings that say, you know, this is a disability. This is the complexity of what pain medicine comes to mean in the 1970s. Now, looking back from the 1980s, critics of this trend, this kind of growing expansiveness of making a space for people in chronic pain in society, in the clinic, as well as in disability, look back and they say something is going on that's connected with how society is changing. One analyst says, over the past 20 years, from the early 60s to the 80s, a significant number of federal cases of disability were decided in which the alleged disability was wholly or substantially related to pain. This is an anxiety that begins to grow, this idea that we are building a welfare state organized around liberal, compassionate pain relief. So you might say that whereas the story I've been telling so far about the 50s and 60s, skepticism that becomes expansive concern, you might say there are liberal trends that relief in the name of compassion and social justice, recognizing individuality and subjective experience as important, leads to the rise of pain care as a field in the name of intersubjective understanding. But you could also see those conservative skepticisms that people like Henry L. Bronda had voiced in the 1950s. Is this real? Are these people trying to get access to something that they don't deserve? Are we really indulging? So the concern has never disappeared that there's social consequences to indulging subjective complaints. Maybe you're feeding addiction or dependency or malingering or what becomes known in the 1980s as learned helplessness, right? Not to mention worries over the economic and social costs of building a disability system, right, that expends your taxpayer dollars to take care of people in chronic pain. And you begin to see this anxiety already articulated in the media in the 1970s and certainly reaching a crescendo in the 1980s. One NBC report in 1972 focuses on the topic pain. Where does it hurt most? And one of the segments of this focus on worthy pain sufferers and burn victims, but another segment focuses on what they explicitly call low back losers, whose learned pain costs the state of California millions of dollars a year. And it's this question about where you draw the line between the worthy pain sufferer and the low back loser that becomes much more part of the clinical, social, and ultimately political conversation. So by the 1970s, even some pain specialists are writing about this question of learned helplessness. This is a textbook from Stephen Brenna, who works in Atlanta. He's in some ways very closely connected with John Bonica, and in the introduction to his book he writes about what he calls the learned pain syndrome and writes that chronic pain is often a conditioned socioeconomic disease. The majority of patients show pain behavior in excess of biomedical findings. Society, he argued, had gone too far in granting monetary compensation for escape from work via pain complaints. So here's a pain clinician working in a multidisciplinary pain clinic saying, really embracing this skepticism that you see elsewhere in society, that we'd gone too far in accommodating people in pain. And you also see in the 1970s the very judges, like John Brown, reconsidering the question of pain and as a disability. You can track it, for instance, in the case of Miranda v. Richardson, another pain complainant, where the judges ruled that pain is not easily diagnosed, but the secretary is not at the mercy of every claimant's subjective assertion of pain when determining eligibility for disability. So even the courts are rethinking the question of the expansiveness. And this took me into the Reagan Revolution, the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. I did some research in the Reagan archives because right after he takes office in 1981, in January, he directs his Office of Policy Development and the Health and Education and Welfare, Health and Human Services now, to look closely at the way in which disability benefits for pain had become so central in the expansion of the welfare state. He came into office saying, you know, government isn't the solution to your problem, government is the problem. And people in pain were certainly one aspect of that problem. He'd, of course, run for president in 1976, vilifying a particular Chicago woman, Linda Taylor, as a welfare queen driving a Cadillac. And so his attack on welfare had these sort of racial undercurrents, too. And in his Office of Policy Development, you could find people who worked for him, like Peter Ferrara, saying the following in early 1981. Over the years, the disability benefit provision was significantly over-liberalized as compared with the original concept of paying such benefits only for truly permanent and total disabilities. They argued that the administration's proposal, which would be to subject people claiming disability to really strict scrutiny and ultimately removing them from the rolls, would change back the definition of disability so that it would rest solely on medical grounds and would not take into account vague factors which are so difficult to determine in a consistent manner. Many saw the story of what became known as the purging of the rolls as connected with the removal of people in chronic pain from the Social Security disability rolls. As one conservative author wrote, disability benefits had ballooned tenfold in 20 years to close to $15 billion. Growth was particularly rapid after the rules were broadened to include mental disabilities, addictions, and subjective states like intense back pain. Reagan attempted to impose rigorous new disability tests on the assumption that many of the so-called disabled were malingerers. The rolls were actually reduced by 10% before Congress halted the effort. This actually resulted in the first Reagan term of the removal of some 490,000 people from the disability rolls, many of whom were claiming pain, chronic pain, as the source of their disability. This, too, took the question of who judges pain into the courts. After all, if you're removed from the rolls, where do you go to seek relief? Not relief in the clinical sense, but relief in the legal sense. The courts become increasingly involved with drawing the lines. In fact, one Institute of Medicine study points out that in the wake of this, some 290,000 people had their benefits restored. And a linchpin new case, really, that symbolizes the new politics of pain and disability relief in 1984 was the case of a Minnesota housewife, Lorraine Pulaski, who brought suit against the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler. And it's the courts, ultimately, that had to draw the line between how you measure pain that's legitimate versus illegitimate. I want to kind of take you through this because it highlights, once again, the way in which policymakers in this time period are trying to thread the needle between the liberal commitments that have brought them this way and the conservative skepticism that's emerging. While claimant has the burden of proving that the disability results from a medically determinable physical or mental impairment, direct medical evidence of the cause and effect relationship between the impairment and the degree of claimant's subjective complaints need not be produced. The adjudicator may not disregard a claimant's subjective complaints solely because the objective medical evidence does not fully support them. This is where the rules for validating who's in pain and what relief they deserve comes from. It comes out of Congress and it comes out of the courts. They're the ones who are drawing the new lines. Now, where has the politics of pain gone since the Reagan era? I want to end by giving you kind of 5 examples of how the politics of pain has evolved and how race and public policy have intersected around pain, bringing us kind of full circle from where I started with sickle cell disease. One of the problems is the recognition, the failure to recognize often that the problem of pain is actually not one problem, but many. And that while some of us might be worried about over-medication, one persistent and lingering problem has also been undertreatment, and that these two issues are concurrent with one another and simultaneous. And here's an article from 1986 that illuminates exactly this point. It drives home this point. Panel finds hospitals stingy with pain drugs, it says. Undertreatment for fear of addiction. It's an irony of our age, says the article, that millions of Americans in hospitals, late-stage cancer patients, burn victims, accident victims, suffer unnecessary, sometimes agonizing pain because doses of narcotic analgesics are too low. But at the same time, in the very next paragraph, the article says there are millions more unhospitalized, often dangerously overdosing on painkillers, often inappropriately prescribed for their chronic pain. This is 1986. This is not 2016, right? So Percodan was around in the 1960s. this debate is around in the 1980s. We're kind of on a continuum where this debate has been going on for a long time about how to draw the lines between appropriate relief and who's in pain. It's also, you might say, by the 2000s, you have a recognition that the access to pain care is also inflected by and informed by a broader question of access to medicine more generally, as well as racial concerns that I illuminated at the very beginning. So you might say that we have a number of different problems that need to be dissected. One question has to do with where does the particular over-medication problem that we're debating today come from? The opioid problem. Well, what I would argue, as I said in a recent article in the Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, to understand the rise of opioids today, we have to understand the new phenomenon of OxyContin, which is the return of oxycodone in a new time-release form roughly 21 years ago, FDA approved in 1997. And the argument here was not unlike the argument you saw for Percodan, which is there's a particular formulation. This was a time release. And because of time release, it was not, they didn't use the language of euphoria. They didn't use the language, but it was about metabolizing something in a very slow and deliberate fashion so as to head off any likelihood of dependency. What it didn't factor in is that people can crush it, you can take it however you want. So OxyContin, you might say, emerges, but its prevalence has to do with really three economic trends that I want to highlight in contrast to what we have today, what we had in the past. One is the new kind of Reagan-era kind of invention of deregulation, the idea that the best economy is the economy that really pushes aside red tape and bureaucracy in the name of speeding the products of the market to consumers. And the drug industry has really benefited from this deregulation trend. So the fact that you all grew up, the younger people grew up watching direct-to-consumer drug advertisements that people like me didn't know when I was a kid is an example of how information is really thrown at the consumer. Consumers are encouraged to consume. And then we worry about the consequences later. Another economic trend has been rural economic decline. I mean, drugs don't find their way accidentally into populations. Certainly OxyContin is everywhere now, but it emerged as what was called at the time hillbilly heroin in places like rural Appalachia, where, once again, this is not an article from this year, this is an article from 2001, 4 years after OxyContin arrives. Already you have articles in the Cincinnati Enquirer that highlight OxyContin as likely to spread in rural Appalachia. Why? Because you have people who work, who have back pain, who need to get back to work, and this is the means by which they will get back to work. So whatever the nature of the economy is, this becomes important. And then you have another phenomenon that I think is underanalyzed, which is the rise of cost containment. The idea that one of the things about the multidisciplinary pain clinic that John Bonica helped to create is that it was costly. It's costly to provide multidisciplinary pain care of the kind that he articulated. And in the era of cost containment, what is our avenue of first resort? It's to find the pill, to prescribe the drug, and to send the patient home. So the politics, you might say the economics of cost containment also explain why OxyContin rises. So economic trends of the last 30 years explain a great deal about where OxyContin, oxycodone comes from. The second point I want to make is that when John Bonica passes away in 1994, this is when the new politics of pain care emerges around pain at the end of life. And I want to highlight that one of the debates we've had since is the question of not whether pain matters, but whose pain matters. Is it pain at the end of life, or pain experienced during work, or other forms of pain? And the answer really reflects a lot about our politics. So after John Bonica dies, right around the time he dies, Oregon passes its Death with Dignity Act in 1994 and then again in 1997. And this provokes congressional officials like, well, Henry Hyde, who many of you might remember from here in Illinois, to propose what he called the Pain Relief Promotion Act of 1999, which really was a way of threatening the physicians who aggressively used pain at the end of life and who may be practicing euthanasia with being prosecuted by DEA. It permitted the DEA to prosecute physicians who dispense controlled substances for the purpose of hastening death. So this is another example where pain medicine becomes highly politicized at the end of life from the conservative kind of, well, religious conservative perspective. At the same time, fetal pain is emerging as a new reference point for conservative evangelical Republicans, arguing that this was a way of both validating the pain of the fetus as real pain, pushing back against liberalizing trends towards abortion access. So you might say if pain politics has a kind of a left and a right, a liberal and a conservative face in the 1990s, it looks like this. Some group of people concerned about pain at the end of life in places like liberal Oregon, and others concerned with pain really before life begins in places like red state Utah. In fact, when my book was reviewed in Science magazine, this is the image they chose to put on it to kind of highlight the way in which different groups of politicians see different pains as legitimate. The courts have consistently been asked to be gatekeepers, to regulate this debate. And in fact, it's the AMA in the question about whether Oregon's Death with Dignity Act was constitutional or whether people had a right to die. The Supreme Court basically took the AMA's amicus conclusion that the recognition that physicians should provide patients pain medication sufficient to ease their pain, even when that may serve to hasten death, is vital to ensuring that no patient suffer from physical pain. That is to say, what the courts basically said is adequate, expansive pain medicine at the end of life, even if it results in death, is ethical and legal. The courts, once again, stepping into and regulating exactly how pain medicine should be practiced. That produced Henry Hyde's Pain Relief Promotion Act, an attempt to rebut the Supreme Court's ruling on and Oregon as well. Now, let me wrap up by saying these issues haven't gone away. In fact, 2 days ago, the Senate failed to pass what it was called the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. That is to say, whose pain matters in the contemporary Congress is very much connected, as this analysis in the New York Times says, with a strategy of the anti-abortion movement, which is newly emboldened under President Trump. It also points out that science around fetal pain is complex. The American Congress on Obstetrics and Gynecology wrote that fetuses do not even have the physiological capacity to perceive pain until at least the 24th week. So where is this pain being constructed and towards what ends? Now let me end by saying a little bit about, those are 4 dimensions of how pain has been politicized. How does it inflect in the question or inform the issue of race? So through the 1990s into the 1920s, a growing kind of drumbeat of studies highlighted that really the problem for African Americans and Latinos in the clinic wasn't over-medication, but it was actually under-medication. And studies tried to grapple with why this might be the case. I won't go into great detail. But what I was shocked by is that in April 2016, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science study that I mentioned earlier highlighted that there were some really false and really disturbing beliefs that medical students and residents had based on a study by a psychologist at the University of Virginia Medical School. What the study found was that many medical students and residents are racially biased in their pain assessment, and their attitudes about race and pain correlate with falsely held beliefs about supposed biological differences, that black people have thicker skins or less sensitive nerve endings than white people more generally. So it's one thing for kind of false ideas about pain to be generated, let's say, in Congress, that serve certain political goals. It's another thing for medical students to have really false ideas about what pain is. What the study found was, medical students and first-year students and second-year students thought that black people's blood coagulated more quickly than whites. I mean, things that have no basis in any kind of medical or scientific understanding, that black people's skins were thicker than whites. And that provoked me to write, even as the opioid story is playing itself out, it provoked me to write this piece in the Daily Beast, on why why this might be a problem. And I think I want to point, this kind of gets back to the sort of the embodied inequalities question. I wrote that in the UVA study, medical students saw what I would argue are, well, what's clearly imaginary biological differences across groups, black and white. Those mistaken beliefs shape their ideas about treating patients in pain differently. And if students and residents act on those beliefs in terms of how they treat people, the confluence of racial beliefs and differences in care would create new disparities of care, adding to those that already afflict our society. So this is an example of how imagined biological differences could become real social disparities. Those who should be the gatekeepers of relief, helping to reduce disparities, may end up doing just the opposite. Right? So to me, that's the real danger of this study, is how the gatekeepers can themselves become part of the problem. Here's another example of the confusion or the problems that I encountered. I was asked by a reporter recently, well, since we have this opioid problem, and if it's true that African Americans were denied access to pain medicine, aren't we doing black people a favor? Right? Whites were harmed by opioids, but blacks are protected. I argued that this was a kind of a perverse sort of theory of beneficial discrimination, right? The idea that, and it's also an example of how you judge black pain through white experience. But it's also an ability to understand that pain is complex, multifaceted, and that we can simultaneously have over-medication in certain places and under-medication in others, in exactly the same way that my respondent in Memphis in the 1960s says, in Oakland, they think we undertreat, and they think we overtreat. It's this sort of fundamental failure to understand the geography of pain, right? The fact that we can have multiple things going on at once that really shapes this bizarre conversation about race. Let me end then by saying that what I hope to have illustrated to you is just exactly why pain is so controversial. And it's not just because it's a problem of intersubjective understanding. What I want to end with is to highlight that what you have in, at least I've tried to capture in my book, is about 70 years of this ongoing political, cultural turmoil with ethical challenges and policy challenges embedded, not only over measurement, and not only over issues that don't at first appear to be connected with pain, like disability and certainly addiction, but also over this question about whose pain matters and how that refracts and reflects our political divides more generally. So one of my chapters is called the divided states of analgesia, where you have red state pain and you have blue state pain, right? You have compassionate marijuana for pain at the end of pain and chronic illness, and then you have fetal pain. And that's playing itself out in legislatures right now. People in chronic pain, I argue, are usually the victims of this politicization. That is to say, what happens when you're debating pain before life begins and pain at the end of life? Whose pain are you not talking about? It's people in chronic pain. What happens when you talk about black pain versus white pain? It really distracts us from the issues that we need to be grappling with. And so that's why when the Institute of Medicine came up with a study on pain, one of the key findings, it's not so much a finding as a call for us. It says what we need is a cultural transformation in the way pain is viewed and treated. And I hope that one of the things I hope my book has done is try to at least begin that conversation and move it along a bit. Thank you all very much.